Via aesthetic works, it recovers the reticular structure that stretched across the whole of the universe before the dissociation of magical thought. While technical thought is made up of schemas, a figural element without ground reality, and religious thought is made up of ground qualities and forces without figural structures, aesthetic thought combines figural structures and ground qualities. Instead of representing elementary functions like technical thought or the functions of totality, like religious thought, it holds elements and totality as well as figure and ground by way of analogical relation. The aesthetic reticulation of the world is a network of analogies. So so here we see the role of aesthetic thought as the reunification of what was separated out into the technical and the religious modes of existence. So there's a sort of recovery of that unity that existed at the level of the magical mode of existence. And so the aesthetic world or the aesthetic mode of existence has a similar structure, which he describes as reticulation. So it's made up of a network structure in the same way that magical thought was structured in a network of key points. But so this is a network not of key points, but of works. So a work of art, through its perfection, points beyond itself towards other works of art, and these works of art form a network. So this again is sort of building on what we saw last time. Just that function of aesthetic thought as reunifying what was split out of magical thought. Okay, so it looks like we're recording, so that's good. So we'll miss the first little bit of today, but that's fine. So are there any other comments on those first couple paragraphs that we just read?
This analogy business seems to be important for the next 2 or 3 paragraphs as well.
Yeah, I guess we'll see that as we go ahead. But in general, the term analogy is something that he puts a lot of emphasis on. Like in the individuation book, he argues that what he describes as transductive thought is the sort of formalization of analogical reasoning, or it's what is valid about analogical reasoning. So transductive thinking is a thinking that that operates by the progressive structuring of a field. So again, it's always this analogy of the crystal forming in a supersaturated solution. So the crystal forms at the surface of the germ, and then it around the surface of the crystal, there's layers of crystallization progressively throughout the solution, and so he uses this as an image for a mode of thinking, this transductive thinking, and he characterizes that as being what is valid in analogical thought. So presumably this network of analogies that he describes here has to do with a similar form of transductive thinking and transductive mode of existence. So maybe we can go on to the next paragraph and we'll see some more about this network of analogies. If someone else would like to read.
Sure, I can go. The aesthetic work is, in fact, linked not only to the world and to man as a unique intermediate reality, it is also linked to other works without conflating itself with them, without being in a material continuity with them, and keeping its own identity. The aesthetic universe is characterized by the possibility of passage from one work to another according to an essential analogical relation. Analogy is the foundation for the possibility of going from one term to another without a negation of the term by the succeeding one. It has been defined by de Solages as an identity of relations, rapport, in order to distinguish it from resemblance, which in general would merely be a partial relation of identity. Complete analogy is in fact more than an identity of internal relations characterizing two realities. It is this identity of figural structures, but it is also an identity of the grounds of these two realities. On an even deeper level, it is even the identity of modes according to which, within the two beings, there is exchange and communication between the figural structure and the ground of reality. It is the identity of the coupling of figure and ground in two realities. Thus there is no true and complete analogy in the domain of purely technical thought, nor in that of purely religious thought. Analogy applies to what one could call the fundamental operation of existence of beings. To that there is in them a coming into being that develops them by making figure and ground emerge. Aesthetics grasps the manner in which beings appear and manifest themselves, i.e. by splitting into figure and ground. Technical thought grasps only the figural structures of beings, which it identifies with its schemas. Religious thought grasps only the ground schemas of the reality of these beings, according to which they are pure or impure, sacred or profane, saintly or sullied. This is why religious thought creates homogeneous categories and classes, like the pure and the impure, recognizing beings through inclusion within these classes or through exclusion from these classes. Technical thought deconstructs and reconstructs the functioning of beings, elucidating their figural structures. Technical thought operates, religious thought judges. Aesthetic thought operates and judges at the same time, constructing structures and grasping the ground qualities of reality in a related and complementary way in the unity of each being. It recognizes unity at the level of the definite being, of the object of knowledge and the object of operation, rather than remaining, like technical thought, always below the level of unity, or like religious thought, always above this level. I feel like I could reread this passage for the rest of the day to try and figure it out.
Yeah, there's a lot in here. Maybe we can go through it sort of in order, like through the paragraph, the long paragraph, and try to figure things out. So the first bit about how the aesthetic work is linked to other works. This is building on what we saw in the last couple paragraphs before this about the aesthetic network in the aesthetic universe being structured as a network. So all of the different aesthetic works have reference to each other. They point towards each other, and that's what makes up the aesthetic universe. Is that network, the network of aesthetic works, and the sort of structuring relationship in that network is what he described here as analogy. And then, so he goes on to characterize analogy in more detail. And then analogy, so he argues that analogy in the more sort of fundamental sense that he wants to use it here, it has to do with not just the figural aspects of a being and not just the ground aspects, but with the relationship between the figure and ground in two different beings. So it's analogy here is a relationship between relationships. So within each being, there's a relationship between figure and ground aspects. And then the analogical relationship is between two such beings and between the relationship between figure and ground in one being and the relationship between figure and ground in another being. So there's a correspondence of structure between one being and another being. So in this case, one work of art and another work of art. They have this correspondence of structure in terms of the way that the ground and the figure are related to each other. And it's noteworthy here also that he distinguishes analogy from resemblance. So a resemblance is just a sort of partial identity. It's like sharing certain properties and not others, or sharing properties to a certain degree, but not completely. And so that's not what he has in mind here. So analogy is a structural correlation rather than a partial identity, which is what resemblance would be. And then, so in the next bit of the paragraph, so because analogy has to do with both the figure and the ground aspect of a being or of a pair of beings, because of that, it means that there's no such thing as analogy, properly speaking, purely in a realm of the technical or in the realm of the religious, because the technical sphere has to do only with the figural side of beings, with these schemas as he describes them, so that they grasp the figural side of a being, and then the religious mode of existence or mode of thought grasps only the ground side of being. So either one of them is incapable of producing an analogy in the proper sense, in the complete sense that he's using it here. So that means that only at the level of aesthetics can you have analogy, properly speaking, because aesthetics grasp both the figure and the ground.
It seems to me to make a connection with the other work in the Vijayasam book. Analogy and aesthetics seem to have some kind of privileged relation to what he calls pre-individual there, maybe?
Yeah, I think we can probably map onto the pre-individual, the ground function here, to at least to some extent. So the ground aspect of a being and the pre-individual milieu out of which the individuated being arises would be sort of correlated concepts. And then so the aesthetic mode of existence, what distinguishes it from the purely technical is the fact that it precisely grasps that the arising of the figures from the ground, or which would correspond to the process of individuation out of the pre-individual. So yeah, in that sense, yes, the aesthetic does grasp the pre-individuated, whereas the technical mode of existence only grasps what is already individuated. And so the next little bit in this paragraph has to do with the what you can call the cognitive operations or the modes of thought that are characteristic of the technical or the technical sphere and the religious sphere. So the technical sphere has schemas, which corresponds to the figural aspect of beings, and it operates. Technical thought operates using schemas, whereas the religious sphere has to do with judgments, and it doesn't have schemas. It has categories and classes. So it judges something to be pure or impure or sacred or sullied, as he puts it here, sacred or profane, saintly or sullied. Technical thought operates using schemas, and religious thought judges using categories. Those are the sets of concepts that correspond in the sphere of cognitive operations or cognitive processes to each of those categories. And then aesthetic thinking both operates and judges at the same time. So it does both of the things that the technical and the religious modes of thought already do.
while reading this passage, I also thought about one particular passage in Merleau-Ponty, Visible and Invisible, because I think it has a similar quality of going to the bottom of in the ontological sense and associating aesthetics with a sort of ontological access. Well, he says, Merleau-Ponty, in that passage, I quote, "Being is what requires creation of us for us to experience it."
Creation of us to experience
So I think in Simondon's passage, it would be the equivalent of something like aesthetics linking to a coming into being, or the thing out of figure and ground. Anyway, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Merleau-Ponty is a sort of a source, Simondon studied with him, I think there are relations between their thought, but as usual, Simondon doesn't cite his sources very much, so it's hard to know for sure in any particular place whether he's thinking of something from Merleau-Ponty. I think that expresses the passage you cited. The passage you cited expresses a similar thought, so the coming into being of an entity here is understood as the formation of the figural out of the ground, and that relation, that operation from the ground to the figural, is what he describes as the fundamental operation of existence.
Can I ask a question and kind of in relation to that last statement? And I apologize about the beep. That it seems that's the technical constraint that you alluded to in the passage there. That the technical kind of has a way of expecting the end user or the human interacting with the technical to be constrained a certain way. So that's what I sort of picked up on, and I can't remember exactly where in the passage or how Simondon worded it. But I have a question, though, going back to the notion of the interplay, the interaction between the technical and religious in the aesthetic experience, that the two are involved. And as you were reading that, I was thinking, and my question is, do you think that it is the technical precursor must reveal itself prior to the religious coming into formation as part of the figure? Since they're both at play in the aesthetic experience, I guess my basic question is, in order to have the aesthetic experience and with the involvement of this idea of the schema, does the technical kind of come before the religious cognition or the religious processes?
Yeah, that's a good point. Oh, yeah, sorry. You have to mute when you're not talking so that we don't get that echo, unfortunately. So I think it's a good question. I'm not sure if you've read other parts of the book, but what we saw a few weeks ago was that arising of the technical and the religious mode of existence as so Simondon describes it as a split. So we start with the sort of basic form of human existence is a magical relationship with the world. So it's it precedes the split into figure and ground or into subject and object. And so the magical universe is structured by these key points in space and time. So it can be like a mountain peak or a certain festival that occurs at a certain time of year or something like that. And then this magical mode of existence splits into the technical and the religious. And so the technical mode of existence constitutes the figural aspect of the magical mode of existence. And then the religious mode of existence constitutes the ground aspect of the magical mode of existence. So there's a split into figure and ground, or into technical and religious. So they both arise at the same time. So the technical and the religious arise together, or out of that same split. So there's no priority in terms of the sort of genetic process that he's outlining in this anthropology in this part of the book. So the technical and the religious are have the same. They appear at the same level of the Genesis. If you look in the chat, if you scroll up a little bit, you should see there's a diagram of the process of the split, the different splits and then reunifications that constitute his genetic anthropology. And then so you'll see on that diagram that the technical and the religious are at the same level. And then the aesthetic is the following level, which is a reunification of that split.
Great. I will review that diagram. I guess one of the questions that I have, but I'll have to, go back to the earlier readings, do more of the reading, is whether the magical experience, or the magical mode of existence, is like a first stage before one can transcend it. Is that like a very primordial state of existence?
Yeah, that's I think that's right. The magical mode of existence is the sort of he describes it as a primitive unity, or a primordial mode of existence. So this is the first stage in this genetic anthropology that he outlines. So it's an anthropology. So it's a characterization of what it is to be a human being, but it lays out different modes of existence through this genesis, through which the different modes of existence come into being. And then so the magical mode of existence is the fundamental or primordial unity. And then it's out of that fundamental unity that other modes of existence are split out and then reunified. So that's the sort of big picture of what he's doing in this third part of the book. I was just trying to repost the image there. I wasn't able to copy it, but maybe someone else could just scroll up in the chat and then repost the image of the schema.
Yeah, I guess I could retry that, or somebody else. But it's I think I saw it. It's posted by Hera. Is that correct? The sort of diagrammatic slide. Is that the one? Is that the one?
Yeah, there's a better Hera posted it, and then someone else posted a better one, which Leif Mason just reposted at the bottom there. So it should be the latest message in the chat, if you can see that. So we start with the magical mode of existence, and then it splits into religion and technics. And then aesthetic thought is the reunification of religion and technics, a secondary reunification. So it's sort of recapturing that magical unity, but at a higher level with a different form of, or a increased structuring. So that's where we're at right now. So some of the other parts we haven't seen yet, some of the other modes of existence that are listed on there, we'll get to them as we continue with the process of Genesis throughout this part of the book. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph, if someone else would like to read. So we're at the paragraph, it is due to the fact.
I can read. Which paragraph are we on?
It is due to the fact.
Is there a number there? I see like 250, 251.
It's just following 262 along the side.
Okay. 1 second. Okay. It is due to the fact that it respects the unity of definite beings that aesthetic thought has analogy as its fundamental structure. Technical thought fragments and pluralizes beings because it privileges figural characteristics. Religious thought incorporates them into a totality in which they are qualitatively and dynamically absorbed, thus becoming less than unity. In order to grasp beings at their level of unity and to grasp them as multiple, without annihilating the unity of each through division or incorporation, each being must be operated and judged as a complete universe, without excluding other universes. The constitutive relation of the beings coming into being, that which distinguishes and reunites figure and ground, must be able to transpose itself from one unity of being to another unity of being. Aesthetic thought grasps being as individuated and the world as a network of beings in a relation of analogy. Thus, aesthetic thought isn't simply a remnant, souvenir of magical thought. It is what maintains the unity of thoughts coming into being, as it splits into techniques and religions, because it is what continues to grasp being in its unity, whereas technical thought grasps the being below the level of its unity, and religious thought above it. Should I continue to the next paragraph?
I think we can stop there.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can stop there and go over what we just read, and then we'll go to the next paragraph, which is a long one. We'll do that afterwards. So this, we see here again, something that we didn't discuss, but it was in the previous paragraph, is this relation to the unity of being. So the technical mode of existence is, let's see, make sure I get this right. Technical thought grasps the being below the level of its unity. So it decomposes a being into different schemas of operation. Whereas the religious mode of existence or religious thought grasps a being from above the level of unity. So religion it always has to do with totality, or a totality in which various beings are inserted. And so it's above the level of unity, whereas the aesthetic mode of thought grasps a being at the level of the unity. So it grasps an individuated being as a process of individuation, and at that level of the individuated unity. And then, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. What to make of that statement towards the end there where he says, aesthetic thought grasps beings as individuated and the world as a network of beings in a relation of analogy?
Yeah, so the idea here is that each being understood in aesthetic thought, so each work of art or other being that is treated as having aesthetic value, it is grasped at the level of unity, as I was just describing. So it's as opposed to the technical thought, which grasps it below the level of unity, or religious thought that grasps it above the level of unity. So each individual being is grasped at that level of unity. And then each of those beings has that relation of analogy to other beings, other works of art, and they form a network through that relationship of analogy. And so the aesthetic universe, or the universe of the aesthetic mode of being, is structured in the form of a network of analogical relationships.
Okay, so the problem I have with the use there of analogy is that although I'm in agreement with, like, let's say, the notion of the relations of, let's say, these objects of art, I'm thinking, for example, the dialogue is another metaphor. It seems that analogy here is a concept that he builds out of significance, but I'm not sure it really encapsulates well this relation, because the relation between buildings, for example, architects or artists who are situated in such a way that forces them to kind of carry on with a unspoken dialogue amongst other artists that they are in community with, whether they're actually have relations with those other artists or have been in contact with their works. I think that these relations are more kind of semiotic or maybe even dialogical, like there's a and so but it seems that Simondon is referring to those types of relations as analogy.
Yeah, I think I mean, I think I get what you're saying about understanding the relationship between different artists as a dialogical relationship, or as something that has a linguistic structure, which is a structure through semiotic or linguistic terms. I think the reason why Simondon would not want to have that type of relationship be the sort of structuring relationship of the aesthetic universe is that that sort of presupposes the subject, or not maybe not the subject, but the artist as a being that is capable of communication and the use of signs and so on. So that would be a relationship between artists as people that have properties or capabilities of using signs and using language. But what he wants to look at is not the relationship between artists, but the relationship between works of art. And so that relationship is this structural relationship of analogy. which is more fundamental than the relationship between artists through signs and through language. So this is what underlies that, or part of what underlies that capacity. So in order
Okay. I mean, that's something to contemplate, because, I don't discount the idea that there may be other processes at work, but I just feel like, again, isn't there something that infuses the artworks and makes it difficult for them to really be completely singular? I mean, what actually causes some of the individuation is a kind of recomposition. Isn't there some degree of influence from the network of the individuals producing the art?
Just further to what Nan was saying, I think that might also bring us back into the universe of resemblance. So like when you start to appeal to discourse between people and dialogue and a kind of linguistic semiotics, that you're kind of premising analogy on resemblance, which is something that he's trying to get away from. I mean, that's what I'm hearing coming out of this dialogue between the two of you.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think also one reason why we might not want to understand the structure of the aesthetic universe on the terms of dialogue or communication or something like that is that we can appreciate an aesthetic work even if we have no idea who produced it. So what I'm thinking of is, for example, cave paintings. There are cave paintings that are 30,000 years old in different parts of the world, and you can still appreciate the beauty and the aesthetic properties of these paintings, even though we have no idea. The person who made those paintings, of course, didn't sign their name, or they're not sort of recorded in history because there was no history in recorded sense at that time. But we can still appreciate the aesthetic value of those works despite their anonymity, and we can still. You can still make connections between those works and other works in structural terms, in terms of how the figure is related to the ground and how different forms are related to each other and so on. You can still make those structural analogical connections with other works of art, even though we have no idea who produced those works. So I would say that I think what Simondon is getting at here is that that analogical or structural relationship between works is more fundamental than the dialogical relationship between artists. I should also say, though, we don't need to, of course, accept everything that Simondon says. Of course, we're trying here to understand the work, the text in front of us, and understand his thought in its own terms. We can, of course, disagree with something that he says. So it's possible that maybe you can make an argument that the dialogical relationship is more fundamental than the analogical relationship. That would be an interesting argument to make, but it would be something sort of going beyond the text. So it would be setting yourself in opposition to the text that we're reading. But that would be another enterprise of thought.
Very diplomatic.
Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph, which is long. It looks like it's like 2 pages long, but I can read this one. The aesthetic work is not a complete and absolute work. It is that which instructs as to how to move towards a complete work. which must be in the world and a part of the world as if it really belonged to the world and not simply as a statue in a garden. While statues are beautiful in and of themselves, they do not make a house or a garden beautiful. A house and a garden are beautiful in their own right. It is by virtue of the garden that the statue can appear as beautiful, not the garden by virtue of the statue. It is with respect to the entire life of a man that an object can be beautiful. Furthermore, it is never the object strictly speaking that is beautiful. It is the encounter which takes place about the object between a real aspect of the world and a human gesture. Hence, it is possible for there to be no aesthetic object defined as aesthetic without nevertheless excluding the aesthetic feeling. The aesthetic object is in fact a mixture. It calls upon a certain human gesture, and furthermore contains an element of reality that, in order to satisfy this gesture and correspond to it, becomes the basis of this gesture, to which this gesture applies itself and in which it accomplishes itself. An aesthetic object that would be nothing more than objectively complementary relations would be nothing. Lines would fail to be harmonious if they were not pure relations. A separate objectivity of number and measure does not constitute beauty. A perfect circle is not beautiful insofar as it is a circle, but a certain curve can be beautiful even if it might be very difficult to find its mathematical formula. A line etching representing a temple with very precise proportions merely relays an impression of boredom and stiffness, but the temple itself, worn by time and half crumbled, is more beautiful than the impeccable model of its erudite restoration. For the aesthetic object is not strictly speaking an object. It is also partially the depository of a certain number of appeal aspects, which are subject reality, gesture, waiting for the object of reality in which this gesture can exert and fulfill itself. The aesthetic object is both object and subject. It awaits the subject in order to put it into motion and solicit in it perception on the one hand and participation on the other. Participation consists of gestures, and perception gives these gestures a basis in objective reality. In the perfect model with its exact lines, indeed, one finds all the objective elements represented, figurés, but there is no longer this echoing or appealing that gives objects the power to give rise to living gestures. Indeed, it is not the geometric proportions of the temple that give it this aspect of an appeal, but the fact that it exists in the world as a mass of stones, of coolness, darkness, and stability, which inflect our powers of effort or desire, our fear or our élan in a primary and pre-perceptive way. The qualitative load that is integrated in the world is what turns this block of stones into a stimulant, moteur, for our tendencies, rather than any geometric element that interests our perception. What remains on the sheet of paper where the reconstruction is drawn is nothing more than a geometric characters. They are cold and meaningless because the arousal of tendencies has not been provoked before they are perceived. The work of art is aesthetic only to the extent that these geometric characteristics, these limits, receive and fix the qualitative flow. It is hardly useful to speak of magic to define this qualitative existence. It is biological as well as magical. It concerns the spontaneity of our tropisms, our primitive existence in the world before perception as a being that does not yet grasp the objects, but directions, paths going upwards or downwards, towards darkness and toward light. In this sense, the aesthetic object is ill-named insofar as it evokes our tendencies. The object is an object only for perception, when it is grasped as a localized hic et nunc. But it cannot be considered as an object in itself and prior to perception. Aesthetic reality is pre-objective, in the sense that one can say that the world is above all an object. The aesthetic object is an object at the end of a genesis that confers stability upon it and cuts it out. Before this genesis, there is a reality that is not yet objective, even though it is not subjective. It is a certain way of being in the world for the living thing, comprising the appeal, directions, tropisms in the strict sense of the word.
Jesus.
Yeah, so that was a very long paragraph, which again has a lot in it. So maybe we can go through it in order again, just going through sort of as it progresses. It's also maybe worth mentioning that this type of paragraph is, I think, very characteristic of his style. This sort of sequence of clauses with semicolons that sort of progressively develops is an instance of what he describes as transductive thought. So it's the thought sort of develops itself progressively over the course of a long paragraph and a series of semicolon clauses. So yeah, this stylistic characteristic of his work is reflective of the mode of thought that he's arguing for as well. So the first bit here is he distinguishes between what he calls an absolute, complete and absolute work, and then the aesthetic work, which is not complete and absolute. So the beauty of an aesthetic object has to do with its placement in a world, rather than being sort of self-sustaining. So it's not the statue that makes a garden beautiful. It's a beautiful garden that makes the statue in it have a sense of beauty. So as he puts it, it's not the object, strictly speaking, that is beautiful. It is the encounter which takes place about the object between a real aspect of the world and a human gesture. So it's not this. It's not the object considered as a sort of self-sustaining and a sort of enclosed entity, which is beautiful. It's the object placed in an environment and then encountered by a human being that is beautiful. And so he develops further this idea of the gesture, which I think has to do with tropisms, as he describes it there. So tropism is a term borrowed from animal psychology. It characterizes the behavior of certain animals with relatively simple behavior, where they, for example, or not just animals, but bacteria as well. So they will, for example, either flee the light and head towards darkness, or they will head towards the light. So the world of that animal or that living being is just structured by a polarity of light and darkness. So they head towards light or away from light. But that polarity of light and darkness is the sort of fundamental structure of their world that they behave in. And so a tropism is just a directedness to some property of the environment. So you can have phototropism, so related to light. You can have, chemotropism. I'm not sure if that's the word that is used, but you can have tropisms related to a gradient of the chemicals in a solution. So bacteria will swim up the gradient towards the higher concentration of sugar in the water, for example, or something like that. So you can have different tropisms based on different polarities within the environment. And so he characterizes this polarization of the environment and this relationship to this polarization as a gesture. So in a work of art, we are always related to it in this tropistic way. So we recognize the dark and the light, or the different aspects of the work through this tropistic behavior that the work elicits in us.
Yeah, super cool.
Right, and Laith Mason just posted in the chat a link about tropism in plants, which again, they can respond to light or gravity and chemical concentrations of chemicals in the soil, or etc. So we usually tend to think of plants as having behavior, but they do respond to their environment in adaptive ways, which is basically what we can describe as behavior. And so it's this aspect of the gesture and the tropism that makes it that makes the work of art more than just a sort of a pure harmony of forms. So as he describes it, a drawing of a temple in its sort of perfection and geometrical perfection and completion is not necessarily beautiful. Compared to the real temple, which may be partly ruined, maybe parts of it have fallen down or whatever. But by its the fact that it's structured in relation to human behavior and that human gesture. When there are areas of the temple that will be shaded and cool, and other areas that will be in the bright sunlight. So that relationship to the human gesture is what makes the temple beautiful, rather than just the pure geometrical form of the temple. And then another aspect of that gesture, or another consequence of the gestural character of the aesthetic object, is that the aesthetic object is not strictly speaking an object, or is not purely object. It has an objective aspect to it, but it also has this subjective aspect to it. So it requires the subject to, as he puts it, to put it into motion and solicit it in perception. So it's only through the capacities that a subject has to respond to different properties of the environment and different polarities in that tropistic way. It's only because of those capacities that an aesthetic object is aesthetic. So it's always the encounter of that object with a human, with those tropistic capacities, that produces beauty. It's not the object itself that has beauty considered in isolation.
There's an interesting question. I think it's not certain to what extent beholder's share, as it is called, should have the final word in determining the aesthetic feeling.
One more time.
Right. There's I guess you can so there is a certain subjectivity in what he's describing here, this tropism, as eliciting an aspect of the work of art or the aesthetic object. So there is a subjectivity in the sense that these tropisms will differ from one subject to the next. So not everyone responds in the same way to light and darkness, or to color and form and so on. But I think what he would want to say is that this the work of art relies on sort of fundamental biological capacities to respond to tropisms, rather than more, I guess you could say, cultivated capacities. So again, the more cultivated capacities would be something on the lines of linguistic or cultural standards of a work of art, whereas what he wants to point to here as being the more fundamental structure is the sort of basic biological capacities to respond to light and darkness, or movement, or shape, and so on. And so these are sort of pre-human capacities that are part of what that are elicited by the work of art. So I think he would take them as being not subjective in the sense of being particular to an individual subject, but universal in that sense. And this aspect of the work of art, I think we can also make connections to ecological psychology and the concept of affordances, so it has to do with the aspects that are that make a work of art or an aesthetic object. The aspects that make an aesthetic object aesthetic are not just sort of purely contemplative aspects. They're not just geometrical properties of the aesthetic object, but they're properties that elicit a gesture or an action on the part of the human being. And so the question in the chat here is about my characterization of these capacities as pre-human. So does that mean that animals respond to textures as humans do? I don't think it would necessarily mean that. And of course, there would be variation between different animals in terms of what types of response they have to different textures or other properties of aesthetic objects. But what I was getting at is that there are these sort of fundamental structuring properties of environments in which animals live and behave and move around and so on. So these properties of light and darkness or temperature, the presence of different chemicals, which we can detect through smell or taste. Those properties are aspects of the environment that they don't depend on human beings, but human behavior is responsive to those aspects of the environment. So textures would be one sort of pre-human aspect of the environment that human beings can respond to through behavior. And then other animals might have different responses to some of those textures, but the textures themselves are not dependent on human beings for their existence. Right. So the question again is, is humans responding to textures pre-human? So an example would be seeing paint coming off the painting. Is that non-linguistic or something like that? So I would say, or I think what Simondon would is arguing here is that the sort of fundamental capacity to appreciate a painting or a work of art in general has to do with having these pre-human or these tropistic relationships to aspects of an environment. So it's only because we can orient ourselves toward light and darkness, for example, that we can respond to the texture of a painting and seeing the paints rising above the surface and have an appreciation for that texture. So the fundamental relationship to that texture is through this capacity to respond to light and darkness, for example, rather than a sort of intellectual capacity to appreciate forms in 3 dimensions or something like that. So it's through that gestural relationship to reality, to external entities that that's the sort of fundamental way of seeing or of grasping an aesthetic object. And then so something like a linguistic appreciation or something like a linguistic or a cultural appreciation of an aesthetic object would be a more derived capacity, which would be developed through training in a certain intellectual, artistic context and so on. So there are I'm thinking of medieval or Renaissance paintings have a sort of a code where different objects represent different. Like it might represent that the person in the portrait is a powerful person or something like that. So some of these things are derived capacities that you have to be trained in a certain tradition to be able to appreciate. But the more fundamental capacity to appreciate aesthetic objects has to do with these tropisms. So then another question is, where does the painter's gesture come in from Simondon's point of view? That's an interesting question, because so far what we've seen has to do with the reception of a work of art or an aesthetic object rather than the creation of the aesthetic object. So I think if I would hazard a guess, I think that there would be an analogical relationship between the painter's gesture and the gesture that is elicited by the painting in the person who sees it. So he mentions here like a curve in a painting or a statue or whatever it is, this curve that might it can be beautiful even though its geometrical properties might not be it might not be a simple curve like a circle or an ellipse or something like that. The same gesture, or the painter makes the gesture to produce that curve, and then you as the viewer who sees the painting, the painting elicits a similar gesture or a similar curve in, say, the movement of your eyes across the painting, or there might be a sort of a tendency, which of course you're not going to realize, but a tendency to move your hand in the same gesture as to produce the painting. So there would be an analogical relationship in that the gesture that the painting elicits in the viewer, it has the same structure as the gesture that produced the painting in the first place. That would be my guess as towards what Simondon would say about that, but I'm not sure if it's possible that he might discuss that later on in the text. I don't remember. Yes, I started describing the concept of affordances, but then I sort of went on a different track. But I think this is related to what he's describing here. So affordances in ecological psychology are properties of objects in relation to potential actions. So like a chair has the property of being something you can sit on, or a surface has the property of being something you can walk on, or so on. So these are affordances, and ecological psychology, the work of James Gibson, argues that perception is fundamentally structured by these affordances. So what we fundamentally perceive are not objective properties of objects, but affordances what the objects offer towards action. And I think this is a similar concept to what Simondon is developing here. And so he's arguing that our fundamental appreciation of aesthetic objects is not through sort of a pure contemplation or a passive perception, but through our relationship between the object and a gesture that it elicits or that it could elicit. So this potential gesture is the fundamental relationship of receiving an aesthetic object rather than a purely passive reception.
Aesthetic reality is pre-projected in the sense that one can see.
Oh, so Berke had to leave, so that's okay. I think we can continue for a little bit and then maybe end a little bit early today because I have another group right after this one. So I'd like to have a little bit of time to get something to eat in between. yeah, so the next bit in that long paragraph is has to do with the relationship between this this tropistic appreciation of the aesthetic work and perception. So there's this yeah, so perception, as Simondon using the term here, perception is a passive reception of the figural properties of an object or geometrical properties of an object. But he's characterizing the aesthetic, the relationship to an aesthetic work as pre-perceptive, and so this tropistic relationship is pre-perceptive in that sense because it's related to action, whereas perception is a purely contemplative reception of the properties of the object, as Simondon is using the term here.
Genesis, there is a reality that is not objective, even though it is not.
Okay, so I think we can continue to the next paragraph then, if someone else would like to read. So we're at real aesthetic feeling.
Okay, I can read. Real aesthetic feeling cannot be enslaved to an object. The construction of an aesthetic object is nothing more than a necessarily vain effort to recover the magic that has been forgotten. The true aesthetic function cannot be magical. It can only functionally be a memory and a reenacting of magic. It is a magic going backward, a magic in reverse, whereas the initial magic is that through which the universe reticulates into singular points and singular moments. Art is that through which a new reticulation emerges from out of science, morals, mysticism, and ritual, and as a consequence of this new reticulation, there is the emergence of a real universe, in which the effort, which had been separated from itself, and which arose from the internal disjunction that technics and religion underwent, comes to completion, and as a consequence of these two expressions of magic, the initial effort of the structuration of the universe. Art reconstitutes the universe, or rather reconstitutes a universe, whereas magic starts from a universe in order to establish an already differentiated structure that carves the universe into domains charged with sense and power. Art aims at a universe on the basis of human effort and reconstitutes a unity. Art is thus the counterpart of magic, but it cannot entirely be this counterpart until after the two successive disjunctions. Poof.
Right. So here we have the distinction between the magical mode of existence and the aesthetic mode of existence. So in one sense, the aesthetic mode of existence repeats the magical mode of existence or returns to that that unity that was characteristic of the magical mode of existence, but it also it doesn't just repeat the magical mode of existence. So it's fundamentally secondary to that split into technical and religious. So the difference has to do with the you could say the direction of the mode of thinking. So whereas in the magical mode of existence, the unity is presupposed, and then the split arises out of it. In the aesthetic mode of existence, the split is presupposed. The split into figure and ground or subject and object is already presupposed, and then the aesthetic mode of thinking works to reunite those split aspects. So there's a difference in direction of the way that the mode of thought works between magic and aesthetics.
Hmm. Is the technical object going to come back in here?
We do see more about the technical object later on. I think it might be the next section in relationship to science. We haven't seen that relationship yet, which is another part of that genesis that is in the graph there. So we'll see more about the technical object in relation to science, but I'm not sure if there's any more in relation to art. I can't remember for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a long section where we still have another 6 pages in this section. So we're not going to finish it today, but maybe the next time we'll finish it. Maybe we'll read one more paragraph and then we can end it for today. So I can read the next paragraph. There are 2 partial forms of art, sacred art and profane art. Art can intervene as a mediator between the mystical attitude and the ritual attitude. This art is like the act of a priest without being what constitutes a priest. It rediscovers something of the mediator that has disappeared within the breaking apart that led to the appearance of the mystical attitude and the ritualistic attitude in place of religion. Sacred art is at once gesture and reality, object and subject, because it is at once the aesthetic attitude and the work. The work can exist only as something that is played. It comes from inspiration. Art is made of artistic activity and of the objectivized, actualized work. In this sense, there is mediation because there is celebration. I'll just continue in the next short paragraph as well. In the same way, profane art installs its object, namely the result of the artistic work, between theoretical knowledge and moral exigency. The beautiful is an intermediary between the true and the good, if one wishes to return to eclectic terminology. Like the tool, the aesthetic object is an intermediary between objective structures and the subjective world. It is the mediator between knowledge and will. The aesthetic object concentrates and expresses aspects of both knowledge and will. Aesthetic expression and creation are at once knowledge and act. The aesthetic act comes to fulfillment, like knowledge, within itself, but aesthetic knowledge is mythical. It harbors a power of action. The aesthetic object is the result of an operation that is intermediary between knowledge and action. So here he introduces the distinction between sacred art and profane art. So sacred art would be art that has to do with the religious mode of existence. And then profane art, I suppose, would have to do with the technical mode of existence. So these are the sort of 2 sides of art in relation to the 2 modes of existence that precede art, or precede the aesthetic. So in sacred art, it intervenes within religion, and it mediates between the mystical attitude and the ritual attitude. So the religious mode of existence would have these 2 aspects, this ritual aspect and the mystical aspect, and then the sacred artwork or sacred art would mediate between those 2 aspects. Right, so we haven't really seen that split within religion into the mystical attitude and the ritual attitude. He just sort of introduces it here without really explaining it. But it looks like, so it looks like there's a similar type of split of the religious mode of existence into the mystical and the ritualistic, in the same way that the magical mode of existence splits into the technical and the religious.
Now, is he splitting them in such a way that he's going to go and it sounds like he may have done this before, but contribute a lot of attribution or attributes to the splitting? I mean, he's splitting them for a reason, some sort of differentiation.
Yeah, whatever.
Right? I mean, it sounds like they might have. He's going to set out to talk about the different attributes of these separations.
Yeah, so this split doesn't seem to be as fully fleshed out as the previous one. So the split into technical and religious mode of existence, he definitely does sort of explain the different attributes of those two modes of existence, as the figure and ground, or the subject and object sides of the split. But this split, he doesn't really explain what it consists in. He just sort of, I guess, presupposes that we know what a mystical attitude and a ritualistic attitude would mean. He doesn't really explain that for us. I can't remember if he develops that in more detail in the rest of the section that we haven't read yet. But so far, from what we see now, he hasn't explained what that split consists in.
And so, what about this intermediary, though? He says the aesthetic object, was it? That's an intermediary between, if I recall correctly, I don't have the text in front of me, the profane and the sacred.
Well, the aesthetic object is just a mediator.
So it's not the profane and the sacred that it mediates between. It's the profane and the sacred are two forms of art. He describes as partial forms of art, and then the sacred form of art would act as a mediator between the mystical attitude and the ritualistic attitude within religion. So if we think of that diagram again, religion would be split into a mystical attitude and a ritual attitude, a ritualistic attitude, and then the sacred art would be the mediator between those two forms of religion, or two attitudes within religion. That's the role that this partial form of art is playing. The sacred art is playing that mediating role. And then on the other side, we have profane art, which mediates between theoretical knowledge and moral exigency. So as he puts it, the beautiful is an intermediary between the true and the good. I guess this would have to do with the creation of an aesthetic object as so profane art here meaning art that is not sacred. So I guess we can think of, for example, Renaissance painting introduces the art of perspective, which is a sort of geometrical construction of a painting. So it sort of builds on a theoretical knowledge of perspective and the geometrical properties of linear perspective. And then I'm not really clear on what exactly moral exigency has to do with this here, but presumably there's some moral aspect of the work of art as well, or sort of moral aspect that is united with the theoretical aspect in the work of art. But I'm not really clear on how that is supposed to work. Possibly, this is just a guess, but this possibly has to do with the gestural character of the work of art that we saw in the previous paragraph. So, insofar as a work of art elicits an action from the viewer or the audience, so insofar as it requires that. gesture or action from the audience, there would be a certain moral character or normative character to that work of art, given that the action is structured by norms of some kind. That's my guess.
I mean, that makes sense to me. Because I was thinking in terms of how my earlier question about the technical object was kind of about, well, what about things like modernist art, which are often sort of, lots of geometry and very diagrammatic and very sort of abstract and sort of resembling diagrams of a technical object in certain examples, and sort of how that might be a profanation or something like that, or that it would be that it would sort of encounter like there would be some moral judgments that would be ascribed to it when it first sort of came on the scene in terms of challenging people's perceptions or something.
Yeah, sorry, I missed a part of that. But I think you were talking about modernist art and how it relates to a technical object. Yeah, I was just saying that I only got part of what you said because it sort of froze. I guess that was probably when it crashed on your side. So you were talking about the way that the technical or modernist art and its relation to the technical object.
Right, and just that it might be understood as a kind of profanation or something like that. That it might be, and a kind of like that the moral agency, that the kind of the reaction to the gesture would be one that would be where people would find it immoral or something like that, or they would find it against. I don't know. I'm struggling for words here, but just that they would find it against a sort of dominant aesthetic or something like that in a way that would possess this kind of moralizing around it or something.
Yeah, that's another possibility that I hadn't thought of. So I guess you could think of the sort of reaction that like Cubism, for example, or other forms of non-representational art elicited at the time they were introduced, where people had this reaction of horror, and they caused a sort of scandal. And like I know in Nazi Germany, there were like exhibits of what they called degenerate art of different forms of non-representative art, like Paul Klee and Kandinsky, I think, and people like that were exhibited as degenerate art. So this type of moralizing attitude toward the artistic work, as something that is a profanation of something that should be sacred. I think that could be part of what he's getting at here as well. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's great. You get what I'm saying for sure with the example that you just gave, for sure. I think we should call this to an end, maybe. It's just the time is left.
Sure. Yeah, I think that makes sense. That will give me some time to eat something before the next group starts. So, do you know if you got the recording or not?
I think it's been working. Yeah, so I'll save it out and reduce it down to an MP3 or something, and I'll hand it over to 61 to put up on YouTube. I'll put it on Google Drive somewhere.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks for doing that. Hopefully that we'll be able to do that in future and keep the recordings going.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks a lot for everything again, Nun. We'll have a good second session.
Yeah, thanks. See you.
Bye.